There is no sexy intro to today's video because today we're going to be talking about really the not sexy part of retirement planning. Now, if you've been following along, this is the fourth of a 5-part video series where we're exploring navigating the retirement risk zone, which is the financial planning method we use to help retirees and pre-retirees who are in the retirement risk zone, which is the 10 years pre-retirement and the first 10 years in retirement, navigate this phase, make some of the most impactful and influential financial decisions they'll make in their life, and do so confidently so that they feel good about the decisions leading into retirement. Today, we're going to be in phase 4 or module 4 of navigating the retirement risk zone. And we're going to be talking about how to set up a feedback loop so that we can make better financial decisions. Just to do a quick recap, up to today's video, we will have covered 3 phases. We will have done a financial assessment. So we get essentially our starting health history chart. We will have constructed a prescription, which is put together the set of most influential and impactful financial planning actions. We will have implemented the prescription, which is set up and take care of the most urgent and influential action items, and then spread out and create a task management system for how we're going to address longer term action items. And today we're going to be talking about why and how we want to set up a feedback loop, which is really just a tracking mechanism for how we're going to monitor the progress and influence of the financial planning decisions that we are executing on. Now, this is, in my opinion, the most important part of the process, and also most likely to be overlooked part of the process because it is not sexy and it is very hard to execute. It's like pushing a weight up a hill, but it is by far the most important part of this plan. And in order to set the stage for this, I'm going to share a few analogies, healthcare, and use that as the guide for retirement, which I have done several times in this video series and will continue to do here. With healthcare, we have a similar mechanism. We have go through a process of setting up an assessment. So we have a starting health history chart. We create a prescription, and then what we need to do is go out and execute on that prescription. But as we execute, we need a way to monitor the progress. And so in this video, I'm going to show healthcare on one side, retirement on the other, and how similar and analogous they are so that we can create some frame of reference for why it's so important to set up a system or a structure of having a feedback loop. Let's assume that we have a health score of 50 and our goal is to get to 90. In retirement planning, it might be the same. You might have a Monte Carlo score of 50 and want to get to a Monte Carlo score of 90. In most cases, we're going to have certain indicators that are a really good directional guide of our starting health or starting financial health. But there are some deceptions and issues with using those simple measures as the only measure. So in this case, we're going to use weight as an example of this. Weight is by far the most easily visible measure that tells us the most at a very simple manner about our health. The problem is it tells us directionality. It tells us generally if we would be healthy, but it doesn't tell us any specifics about whether to know we're actually healthy or not. And you can use it as correlative data, but you can't use it as really definitive data. And in retirement, the analogous element to weight would be portfolio value. So we tend to use how much saved assets we have as a great indicator of how financially healthy we are in preparation for retirement. The problem is it's a good directional guide, but it is not a good specific guide because $1 million of saved assets might be great for someone who spends $50,000 a year in retirement. By the way, this isn't financial advice, just a random example. But $1 million in saved assets might be nothing for someone who spends $200,000 a year in retirement, right? So it's really relative to other measures. And so the purpose of showing this is to say, what do you do? If you want to use weight or other indicators, we need to have some kind of measures as a guide. And that is the purpose of setting up this feedback looping system. And so what we really want to do here is we want to track the right things. We need a list of the right metrics to track, both for health or for retirement, in order to compare our progress to beginning measures and really identify if we're making progress over time. So to carry the healthcare analogy forward a little bit, and then we'll move to retirement, weight is a good directional guide. And then below weight, you have all sorts of other elements that you would want to track to measure your actual health. And I've just listed random examples on the screen here. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a healthcare practitioner. It's just a way to start thinking through, because what we have to think about is not just what are we going to track, but we also have to understand what's the baseline, how frequently are we going to track this, and then we need to set up some measures after that tell us if we're meeting our original objective and how long it might take us to get where we want to go. Because that's actually a critical element of this. Is one of the main reasons people gain weight, lose weight, gain weight, lose weight, gain weight, lose weight, or in finance, save money, spend money, save money, spend money, get in debt, get out of debt, get into debt, get out of debt, whatever, is because we don't really know how long things are going to take. We think things are usually going to be a lot faster than they are, As humans, we tend to think that things are quicker to have results, but just much more complicated. So if we just put in 30 days of really hard effort, we'll get a great result at the other side. When in actuality, it's the opposite. Things are much, much simpler than we expect. They just take a lot longer for us to get the result we hope for. And so that's why we need this kind of a grid that I'm showing on the screen here, where we show a list of measures that we're going to test. We set up objectives of how frequently we're going to test them, and then we monitor and track the baseline against the progress over time and give ourselves some idea after a period of time of tracking of how long these things are going to take. And on the screen, you can see here some of the healthcare measures I would suggest, or I like to think through when I analogize this to finance are, weight as a general measure, but then things like a resting heart rate or blood pressure or your activity level or your body fat or even a blood panel. And you measure these with different frequencies, and the different inputs at the top that have a shorter feedback loop, a more daily cycle, are going to feed into and inform the things that have a longer measuring cycle. So things like blood pressure, if you measure it every day, and activity level, if you measure it every day, are going to feed in a material way into the results you might get on a blood panel. Now let's move to the retirement analogy here, and we'll talk about what those things are for retirement. And I'm going to show you a real-time example of how we track this and how we measure these things with a template that you can then take and download and use if you'd so choose. Now in retirement, portfolio value, as I mentioned, is much like weight in healthcare. It's indicative of a directional trajectory, but it's not indicative of anything specific. And it's also a much more lagging indicator than weight. Weight is a lagging indicator, but portfolio value is a truly lagging indicator in that there's all these other things that feed into how our portfolio value will grow or shrink, and also what that portfolio can produce for us. In retirement, the things that really move the needle and are like the daily activities are things like tracking your income, your expenses, tracking your distribution rate. Now you're going to have in retirement this phenomenon of a planned distribution rate, what you think you're going to need to withdraw, and then you're going to have what's actually called your actual distribution rate, which is based on your real spending behavior in real time. And they won't always match up perfectly synchronously. And so you want to track both because you want to understand how big the deviation is between your planned distribution rate and your actual distribution rate. And then those two things, your two different types of distribution rates, will inform your required rate of return and ultimately your final portfolio value, or your starting and ending portfolio value. The idea here is if you track these things in a regular manner, you're going to have a lot more information. And when we move into the next module for next video, we're going to talk about what do you do with this information. The perfect place to start is to track it. If you don't track it, you won't know what to do. And so that's why we're here. Now, if we take this analogy a step further, I'm going to in a second here show you an actual scorecard that you can use, a template. But the idea here is you can take everything I'm saying now, and I've only been speaking, let's say, to a retiree insofar as I've only really addressed the distribution rate part of the retirement puzzle. But you could also take anyone who's in the left side of this graph here, the retirement risk zone, anyone who's in the years before retiring. And you could just replace the concept of distribution rate with the concept of savings rate. If you're in the 10 years before retirement, what's really critically important to you from a mathematical perspective is your expected savings rate versus your actual savings rate. If you build a retirement plan that says you need X dollars of assets at the point at which you are able to retire, and you have it all built off of a model that says, here's how much we expect to save each year. Well, you need to actually also track how much you actually save. And if those deviate, you need to understand how that's going to inform the plan and have some contingency plans in place. So I just wanted to illustrate this to show we're not neglecting the pre-retirement portion of this. It's actually just switch the word distribution rate and input the word savings rate. And you'll see that when I show you the calculators here in a second, they're almost exactly the same templates. The only difference in what they track is savings rate versus distribution rate. So let's move over to a tracker. So I'm just going to show you a retirement plan tracker here. It's very, very simple. We have 4 sheets here. One of them has a start of the year absolute value tracker that tracks things like what our guaranteed income expectations are for the year, what are our expected expenses for the year, what is our expected required portfolio income, which is really just our expected distribution amount for the year. And then we can put that into some metrics that allow us to understand these as percentages of our portfolio. So what is the expected distribution rate or drawdown percent? What is our required rate of return as a result of that? The required rate of return here, I just have a simple formula, and this is not financial advice, this is just illustrative, but we just have a simple formula in here that says we want to have a rate of return that is adjusted for inflation or allows for inflation. And so we're just adding 3% to the drawdown rate and saying if we just meet that, we'll at least be able to produce our income each year without running out of money and without losing our purchasing power. And then continuing on this analogy, we have a beginning of the year starting portfolio value and a beginning of the year starting net worth. And this would be the equivalent of taking your weight, your blood pressure, your cholesterol, your blood panel, and also maybe even doing a food log on day one of your health journey. You just note it as a point in time snapshot and use that as your original health history chart. And then we have a sheet for monthly tracking items and a sheet for quarterly tracking items. And they're very, very simple. In the monthly tracking items, we care about things like cash reserve. Are we keeping our cash reserve level over time, or does that value change? We care about our income. Is that income stable, or does it fluctuate month by month? And specifically, when we say income in this sheet, we're talking about guaranteed income, not about your portfolio income. And then we have our expenses, and we would track this or recommend tracking this in real time using an app or something that actually tracks it to the dollar every month. Because what you can see here is if our expenses are higher than expected, in this presentation, we have an expected expenses annualized of $60,000, which is $5,000 a month. But here we look on this monthly sheet and we see that this hypothetical person or couple spent $6,000 in January instead of $5,000. Well, on an annualized rate, that would put them at $72,000 of expenses, which is $12,000 higher. It's 20% higher than our expectation, which would significantly impact the actual drawdown rate of the portfolio were that expense load to carry forward for all 12 months. Now, the point of this is just to illustrate that if you don't track it, you don't know that these things are happening. Once you track it, you know they're happening and can therefore adjust behaviors or make decisions based on that knowledge. And now you can see here that this person or hypothetical person has a planned distribution of their level portfolio income amount that we discussed in the last slide, and their net income is negative. This means they need to draw money from somewhere else. In this case, we're going to assume they draw it from their cash reserve. And then you can see that this would flow forward. We would need to then have a higher distribution rate in future months in order to refill the cash reserve or in order to supplement for a higher level of expenses, which ultimately changes the actual distribution rate of the retiree or pre-retiree in question. Now, again, you could switch everything I've said where I've used the word distribution, just switch to savings, and that's how you would apply this to a pre-retiree. So if someone is overspending compared to their expectations of what we thought they'd spend, they will end up saving less money and therefore having a lower savings rate, which also means they will arrive at their retirement target with less in assets than we expected and will therefore need to make some set of informed decisions about what behaviors to change to accommodate that. To keep going forward, this is very technical, I know, but now we would have a quarterly tracking sheet. Now in here, we use this for internal with clients. So we have a system here where we track whether the bookkeeping and our meetings have been held, because those are great accountability checkpoints for the clients we work with. But you don't need this. You could just delete these two rows and continue to work your way down and have quarterly metrics. The reason for quarterly metrics is we don't want to make exaggerated decisions about monthly data, because for instance, you can see here, if we go back to the monthly tracking, that this couple or household or whatever spent more money in January than expected, but in February and March, those amounts leveled out, and ultimately they end up at the same distribution rate we would have expected. It just wasn't level month by month. It was a higher distribution in January, but a much lower distribution in February and March in this hypothetical example. And so we want to use quarterly data as a better gauge because it smooths out weird discrepancies. And so this is just a summary sheet for quarterly data, where it tracks, again, the most important things that we care about tracking: income, expenses, expected savings rate or expected distribution rate, and then annualizes that so we can see if this quarter of results were to continue for the rest of the year, how would this play out compared to our beginning of the year expectations. Now, this also has a section for us to track rate of return quarter to date and annualized. Unfortunately, in this example, I don't have an example to show, and that's because it's going to be person to person based on your portfolio construction, but you would want to track rate of return on the portfolio compared to, especially if you're in the retired phase and you're taking distributions. It is much, much more material that you monitor and track and find that those things are consistent with each other, that your rate of return and your distribution rate and the actual amounts of those things are tracking well together. And then last but not least, you have an annual snapshot that is an end of year snapshot. And ignore the dates here because they're a little off, but because we're just using this illustratively, you want point in time snapshots. You want a beginning of the year snapshot and an end of year snapshot so you can track how much progress has been made that year, how far did we deviate from expectations. And then again, when you watch next week's video and we talk about what do you do with this information, you can then start to make informed decisions with this information, but it all starts with the tracking. And so to round out this presentation, I just kind of touched on this. The question is, what do you do with this information? The idea here is tracking helps you get accustomed to the pulse of your finances. If you weigh yourself every day, you start to understand how your weight will fluctuate based on activities you do or what you eat. Same with your finances. If you do your bookkeeping every month, you start to understand, what about birthday season of the year? What about holiday season of the year? When does my expenses go up or go down? How does it fluctuate? What is the pulse of my financial life? And only by tracking can you monitor that. And to repeat and conclude here, In the next module, which we'll go into in the next video, we're going to talk about how you manage the system and discuss what you do with this information as you track it. To wrap up here, this was module 4, setting up a feedback loop of the navigating the retirement risk zone planning methodology. Next week, we'll go into managing the system long-term, and we'll conclude the entire planning process there. And if you're not already in our email queue, I've mentioned this in other videos, but all these videos will be available for free on YouTube. You can watch them and do whatever you'd like with these. You can ask questions, put comments below. But if you're in our email queue, you will also receive links to our financial planning software, as well as spreadsheet templates that we reviewed in these presentations, as well as an extra set of emails that give you some guidance and instruction on how to use the financial planning software and the spreadsheets and templates so that you can make use of this if you'd like to. So if you're not already in our email queue, you can go to any form on our website at www.thepeakfp.com, submit any form there, and you will be added to the email queue where these videos would be delivered to you by email, as well as these supplemental videos which give you the instructions and access to the planning tool. As always, thank you for your time and attention. If you have any feedback, please put them in the comments below the YouTube video or send them to us if you're watching this via email. If you'd like to schedule a free consultation with our fee-only financial planning team, you're more than welcome to do so. You can also do that from our website at www.thepeakfp.com. Thank you as always for your time and attention, and see you in the next video.